And thank you again to all three of you for just setting us out on this incredible series of conversations that are happening today and the next 2 days. We have about 20 minutes for questions and discussion, and I'm going to jump right in to the questions. We have two initial questions, and the first one is, I think, directed specifically at you, Professor Omamoto. Is the incarceration alternative mentioned for young men only?
No, the effort that's happening right now is it's a kind of a public-private partnership with the state of Hawaii Department of Human Services that runs the youth facility. There's one youth facility in Hawaii, and a group of a consortium of community-based organizations that are now populating the campus upon which the prison sits, and is kind of surrounding it with many different kinds of culture-based programs that address vocational, sexual trafficking, homelessness, and other challenges that youth are facing for both men, girls, and boys. And they're very close to closing the women's prison, the girls' prison, which we hope will happen in the foreseeable future. And but it all depends on really bringing together and really creating the robust alternatives, so that these alternatives aren't a bridge to nowhere, with and lead to long-term problems as well. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks so much. And then the second question, I believe, is directed towards you, Professor Carpio. Did the dividing line you depicted have an economic basis? And you talked about at least two dividing lines. There was the dividing line that runs the length of the West Coast and cross into the Southwest, but then also that unbelievably vivid image that you give of the dividing line that literally divides one side of the street from another. You just need to unmute yourself.
That is the term of the year or year and a half. You're muted. The question of it being an economic dividing line is actually very clear, because when you look at especially in Arizona, when you look at the line, it's along Grand Avenue. If you look on one side, it's all the Japanese American flower farms, and it was open land. If you remove people from that, it opens up that land. So part of it has to do with and that line goes up through. It is about the economics, the taking of or creating, opening up available lands, valuable lands, and that's what that removal really did. And it's part of the presentation. I also wanted to show the timeline, because if you look at those dates, they're very close. Within a month, they make these decisions and they implement. There was already planning going on, and they'd already looked at the census also and knew where a lot of Japanese Americans were living, and knew where sort of in some ways to draw that line. I mean, what makes someone an enemy alien on one side of the street and not on the other side of the street? So that it's very clear that it becomes something else that is at play. And so that's what you start seeing along those lines.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this next question, because it's so embracing, and I think it will be a way that we can begin to perhaps mark the connections between the themes that the three of you have raised up. So this next question is, can you each identify 2 or 3 actions that could be taken to help remedy the harms, heal the wounds of these histories that you have laid out for us? And I just, maybe I can just riff on this a little bit and add to this a sort of a question that's formed for me. And it begins with this distinction that you make, Professor Capio, between event and structure. And this notion of, I think what historians would refer to as the longue durée, is that when you start to actually look at long histories, you really start to see the structures that define those long histories. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the shifts that have been occurring recently towards apology, towards reparation, towards structural transformation, and how those two seem to have a tendency to fall into an event that is intended to sort of mark a time before and after, as opposed to thinking of these apologies, or these processes of reparation as in themselves structures that require a kind of long durée as well. So that they're not just moments in a sequence of events, but that they in fact are really profound transformations, and possibly in a way that connects with what you were talking about, Professor Uemoto, which is that the formation of new epistemologies. So with that little riff in place, what are the processes of shift, of transformation, these abolitionist frameworks, for example, and then something I know that Professor Fullilove and I have been sort of in conversation about with a wonderful group of folks is this notion of collective recovery as well, and this idea of a recovery century. So a deep commitment, a 7-generational arc of healing, as opposed to simply managing these problems. So I don't know if one of you wants to sort of take the lead on responding to this question. Yeah, Mindy.
Perhaps I may. Thank you, because I can segue from what you just said. Out of our 400 years of inequality project, we had to look at, and therefore, what do we do? And so one of the things that the team worked on was what we call the People's Pathway to Equity. And so we have a set of ideas on our website, ppe.org, about how do you begin to know the history and to think about it in your place, and then to think about how do we move forward together. I think the key thing is that if you have broken social bonds and created a structure that doesn't erase once, but erases many, many, many times, that a single round of reparations is going to be followed by what? More theft. So how do you actually stop the process, this constant process of serial forced displacement, serial theft of whatever the people accumulate? That becomes a very deep question, and I think people are lightly talking about reparations without having analyzed the deep structure. And I certainly agree with you, Robert, how lovely it is to lift up the difference between event and structure. If we're in a structure of serial forced displacement and you give people some money, what happens next? Some other people come and steal it. And if there's anything people know how to do in capitalism, it's rob other people. So we have to take this seriously. And I highly recommend our website for the People's Pathway to Equity, ppe.org. Thanks for throwing that out there, Robert.
All right, thank you. Professor Capio or Professor Uemoto, do you want to pick up this thread?
I want to go. Yep. Oh, sure. I'll pick up the thread next, and then hand it to Mila. Building on what Mindy said, I think that serial forced displacement is very real and very imminent today. I really worry about all the people who are going to lose their homes because they're going to be evicted, after the moratorium ends. And then there are people who have fallen in arrears of their mortgages because of the pandemic. And I think, this always hits people of color, low-income people a lot harder than the rest of the population. And so I think it's, there's a balance between kind of the doing the healing kind of work, which is really, really important. And then also dealing with the kind of policies and structures that allow these things to continue to happen. It requires political mobilization and around policy changes that are really going to make a big difference in people's lives. So again, dealing with the kind of the structures of inequality and racism and dispossession, and then as well as kind of the more interpersonal healing of people and communities. And let me just say one thing about the structural, there's a lot more discussion about structural racism. And I just wanted to just say that, part of it is the policy paradigms, just how we think about issues. So how do we think about this issue of people falling into arrears during the pandemic, right? It's also part of a pandemic problem. It's not an individual responsibility problem. So the paradigms through which we see these problems is really important, because they affect then the laws, policies, rules, and procedures, as well as the professional roles and behaviors of people who, are embedded within the systems, both private and public. Myla?
I agree. I agree with my colleagues here. There's, if we're going to talk about two or three, this is a large systemic issue, and for me, looking at it as that structure, that systemic, looking at the policies, this ongoing. One of it is we need to address some of the issues. I mean, we're talking about capitalism, and it's a great, what capitalism knows how to do is steal or theft, and which is true. But it also, I think, in some contexts, it's addressing something like that is very difficult. So how do we? Where are the steps that we need to take? And for me, I'm looking at it in the context of just the even acknowledgement. This is just, the land acknowledgements have been just recent, and acknowledging to work towards making what's been invisible visible is part of those steps, and access to healing ways, that there's not one cookie cutter way of healing, of interaction. The other part is about humanity, is regenerating, and our interactions with each other on a human level, being human, acknowledging each other as human, and starting those relationships with each other in ways that I think they've been severed. These are larger ways, but how can we find? I mean, in Australia, there was an activist. One of the things, the song, he wrote a song. The song says, "From small things, big things grow." And I think that's one of the things, is where are the pieces? Where are the seeds? I'm really about food sovereignty. What are the seeds that we can plant now that we can start nurturing and growing? And part of them is dealing with, how do we look at policies or some of the initiatives in a very different way? How do we bring in different epistemological views in order to shift the paradigms that create these structures? And I think I'm thinking broad, so sorry.
Yeah. I think last week when we gathered for a preliminary conversation, we knew that this session was going to be one in which we're naming these enormous themes and these enormous complexities, and that they are life's work in being able to engage with them. And this certainly is what we're hearing at the moment. there are a number of questions that I'm going to try and pull together as a question as educators. The four of us all have time in the classroom, I'm assuming. And I'm wondering if we're seeing generational shifts. I wonder if we're seeing in the ways in which younger generations are taking up some of the enormous challenges. I'm thinking of certainly the uprisings last year following the lynching, the murder of George Floyd, and who was on the streets and how those streets were claimed and occupied. And then as I sit in my classroom today, just hearing how young people are working through the pandemic and really yearning for the kind of materialization of this idea that somehow we are all interconnected. So I'm wondering if you're seeing those kinds of shifts that are occurring, and really the understanding that one doesn't jump from one epistemology to another, that this is very rigorous, slow, complicated, often frustrating and difficult work of unlearning in order to relearn. So I know that's also a very, very broad question, but just looking to the youth, and I'm going to begin with you, Professor Umamoto, because the work you've been doing has been so clearly focused on these questions of young folk and how they are beginning to navigate their initial encounters with systems of policing and oppression.
I mean, I'm not in the trenches, so I really qualify what I say. This is my direct observations in my contact with students, but that's been limited over Zoom. So I say this with a lot of caution, but my sense is that there's both anger, frustration, and inspiration. There's a lot of anger at a lot of things, about what previous generations have done to get us in this climate change, precarious climate global situation. There's a lot of anger about police brutality and abuse of power. There's anger at the ways in which those in power that control the internet and everything else, right, are not addressing a lot of the hatred and misinformation that's taking place. There's a lot of frustration that, the growing inequalities really are creating a lot of barriers for them to get an education or get a decent paying job. So I think at the same time, you see a lot of rise in activism. And I think that what I see as important is, there are generations of activists, right, from Mindy's father to the young people we see today, and even before then as well. And I think there are lots of lessons, right, that are lost in history. And so one of the things that I really committed to is to try to make ethnic studies much more available to everybody through an open textbook project and other things, because I think if we don't learn from our history, right, if we don't have that kind of intergenerational dialogue and passing on and exchange of understanding, then I think we're going to continue to make the same mistakes. And it's 2 steps forward. It's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But at least we could get maybe 3 steps forward and fewer steps back.
Yeah, and we must go back in order to go forward, to remember in order to go forward. We have just 2 minutes left, and Mindy or Professor Capio, do you want to have the final word?
Please, Mila, give us the final word.
I'm not sure about final word, but I think one of the things about what's been said is that we need to change. I mean, I think we need to look at these and be active. I mean, activism is also about also support. How do we support some of these actions? How do we support some of the work that's changing or shifting paradigms? How do we develop ways in which we can bring to the table all these different views and ideas and epistemologies, and develop spaces in which we can work together and create changes and shift and help our youth. The activism that's been going on has been wonderful, because it's in a different light. It's saying enough is enough. And I think, what are the ways in which, we can support and develop ways in which we can expand and extend this for our future.
Thank you so very, very much to the three of you for just this wonderful opening to these conversations today. I was thinking, as we were working through today, of a slogan that I recently came across, which is, "We want structural change, not climate change." And I'm certainly sort of hearing this beautiful theme in all of your presentations. So thank you all for being with us for this opening session. I am now going to turn it over to Alejandra, who will welcome the next panel. Blessings to all of you. Go well.